Well, there was an older couple who had been happily married for many years. But they'd always had this one point of contention. This one ongoing disagreement. He had the habit of chewing his nails. And she didn't like it. In fact, it really bothered her. But then one day, she was having a conversation with her friend, and she told her friend, I finally, after all of these years, I have finally found a way to stop my husband from biting his nails. How? Her friend asks. And she says, well, I just hide his teeth. We all have habits, those things that you always do, or maybe a particular way of doing something. There was a dad who had just finished brushing his teeth, and his daughter, his young daughter, runs in and she says, aha, I caught you. You're the one who keeps putting the cap back on the toothpaste. Habits can be good. Habits can be bad. And habits can be really neither. I mean, they could be neither good or bad. It's just what you do or how you do something. But our habits really affect our lives. In fact, that's why people make New Year's resolutions, because they want to change their habits. They want to do something differently. I mean, most of those resolutions are wanting to have healthy habits, like maybe losing weight, eating better, or exercising, something like that. But oftentimes, we don't do what's good for us. We eat junk food, we don't exercise or exercise too little. But today, we're going to talk about habits, but we want to zero in on healthy spiritual habits. Being consistent in our relationship with God. And we're going to see someone who is a great example of this. Daniel was consistent. He faithfully served God. He prayed, he spoke of God, he trusted God, he lived in relationship with God. And people knew it. Not because he was showing off or that he announced it to everyone, hey, I do this and this is why I do it, but because it was just a big part of his life, a big part of who he was. And so it affected his everyday life, and for him, this was just normal life. So we begin today in Daniel chapter 6 and verse 1. It says, it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give account, so that the king might suffer no loss. Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. And so, as we begin reading this, the first thing we need to talk about is, who is Darius? And the reason why we need to talk about that is because his identity is actually disputed by some. And so, if you look at chapter 5, verse 31, the last verse in chapter 5, it said, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So Darius the Mede received the kingdom. But it is a well-known historical fact, well-known from history, that Cyrus the Persian was the king of the Medo-Persian Empire, who conquered Babylon and allowed the Jews to return home from exile. But this Darius the Mede is not found anywhere else in historical documents other than the Bible. At least not in any historical documents that we have yet or have found, and at least not by this name or title. This is the thing about history. You cannot make an argument from silence. In other words, we've never heard of Darius the Mede, therefore he never existed. We can't make arguments about things that we have not heard about. This king didn't exist because we haven't found anything that's written about him. This king didn't do that because we haven't found things written about him. In fact, often these kinds of arguments, these arguments from silences, are later disproven when new evidence is discovered. Let me give you an example. In fact, I'll give you two. King David. For many years, people said there was no King David. The Bible made it up. Then they found a bunch of stuff that talked about David. Or King Belshazzar, who we just talked about last week, the one who saw the writing on the wall. Until recent years, we had no historical evidence of King Belshazzar except for in the Bible. So some people tried to argue that the Bible was wrong. But now we have other historical documents that confirm the accuracy of the biblical record. And so we don't make arguments from silence, or we don't just assume because we haven't found this anywhere that it's wrong. So just because we haven't found it, this specific name or title in other historical writings doesn't mean that Darius didn't exist, or that the biblical writers made a mistake and incorrectly identified him. But do we have any possible explanations for who this guy is? Who is Darius the Mede? I think there are two very plausible explanations for who Darius is. Either he is a governor that went by a different name that was placed over Babylon, or he is Cyrus the Persian himself. Now, to understand either of these two suggestions, you have to recognize that kings and other officials often had more than one name. For example, we saw this even with Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. They had different names. But oftentimes, kings would have more than one name. So some people think Darius was this governor that ruled over Babylon, or was placed over Babylon. However, as we read through the passage, you'll see he's repeatedly called king. So this suggestion isn't impossible, but I'm not quite sure about it. It seems more likely to me that Darius is actually Cyrus the Great, Cyrus the Persian. Now, I'm not going to go into all of the arguments, but let me answer just a couple questions. Darius is called the Mede and not the Persian. So how could Darius the Mede be Cyrus the Persian? Well, as the king of the Medo-Persian Empire, it would not be surprising that he would have a Median title as well as his Persian name. But not only that, Cyrus the Great had a Persian father and a Median mother. And so he was half Persian and half Mede. So he could be called the Mede. All right? And so this isn't impossible. But there's another question that comes up, and it comes from actually this chapter. In chapter 6, verse 28, the very last verse of the chapter says, "So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian." So it mentions Darius and Cyrus, and it seems to refer to them as two different kings. But the conjunction here is translated as and this is the most common translation of this word, of this conjunction. And so it says Darius and Cyrus. But this conjunction could also be translated as even, or namely, or that is. And in other words, so it could be saying that Darius, that is Cyrus, or Darius, also known as Cyrus. And so this verse may very well be making the point that Darius and Cyrus are one and the same person. So, having said all that, now let's get into the story. When Darius took over the kingdom, he wasted no time in organizing his government. And so we're told here that he appointed 120 satraps. Now, the title satrap means protector of the kingdom. And so they were government officials who were assigned to specific territories within the kingdom. And then those 120 district officials answered to 3 high officials who then, of those 3, answered directly to the king. And this hierarchy was established to ensure that the kingdom was well taken care of, and that it didn't suffer any loss, or specifically that the king didn't suffer any loss. Now, this loss could refer to losing territory or wealth, or maybe even specifically talking about tax money. You know, that these people who collect the taxes didn't like slip some in their pocket, or so there were people over them to make sure everything was done right. But it seems to suggest that these high officials supervised the satraps to ensure that things were done well and right, and specifically that there was no fraudulent activity going on that would hurt the empire or hurt the king. But Daniel was one of these 3 high officials. And he was great at his job. Now, I'm guessing that when Darius came in, he heard about Belshazzar's party that was going on when they took the city, and people didn't even notice them coming in. I'm sure he heard about that party. I'm sure he heard about the writing on the wall. And I'm sure he heard how Daniel was the only one who could read that writing and interpret that writing to the king. And then I'm sure he heard how Daniel had served Nebuchadnezzar, the great king Nebuchadnezzar. And so this new king would want the best, the wisest, and the most capable people working for him, right? And so when he would hear all that, he would immediately go to Daniel and say, and look into Daniel and figure out who he is. And so Daniel had already proven his worth, and now he's put in leadership again. Now, at this time in Daniel's life, though, he's between 80 and 90 years old. It's funny, we read through Daniel, and sometimes we don't realize the time that transpires through it, but he's been there a long time. It's been almost 70 years. So he's between 80 and 90 years old, and he's still really good at what he does. And he distinguishes himself above the others. And so Darius is now considering giving Daniel a promotion, so he's over the entire empire. And that means that the other high officials would have to answer to him. Look at verse 4. What do they think about that? Verse 4, then the high officials and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom. But they could find no ground for complaint or any fault, because he was faithful and no error or fault was found in him. So they're jealous. When they hear that Daniel is going to be getting a promotion or might be getting this promotion, they want to stop it. And so it's likely that not all 120 of the satraps were involved here, but the other 2 high officials definitely were. And then there were some others who were in on it. But they look for anything they can use against Daniel. Anything that might disqualify him. And so they look and look and look, and what do they find? Nothing. They can't find any fault in Daniel. That means they can't find any professional problem. I mean, he does his work great. Or they can't find anything ethically that's a problem. He does his work right. So he did his work very well, and he was skilled, and he was competent. But he also was honest. And he carried out his responsibilities with integrity. And so there was nothing that they could accuse him of. Nothing that they could use against him. And there's a challenge for us here in this. Do you do your work well and with integrity? Even in less than ideal situations. So, if someone looked into your work, what would they find? Oftentimes, people do just enough to get by. Or they may even do their work kind of halfway. And people will often choose to be dishonest if they think that it will benefit them. But you work as to the Lord. Work as to the Lord. Remember that you're working for Jesus. Look at verse 5. Then these men said, "We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God." So they finally conclude that there's only one way that they can bring him down. And that's if they find something in Daniel's religious practice that somehow conflicts with Persian law and culture. Now notice this. They know about Daniel's faith. They know his lifestyle. They know his habits. They know that Daniel is firmly committed to his faith in God, that he is fully devoted to God. They know that Daniel won't compromise. And so they conspire to find something in his personal religious practice that they can use against him. Now in this, there's another challenge for us. Do people know about your faith commitment? Do they know that you believe in Jesus and are living for him? Do people expect you to think and to talk and to act a certain way? In other words, do they know that you are devoted to God, and because of that, they assume that in any situation you would be godly, that you would be holy, because that's just your normal way of life. And so that's the character that they expect out of you. And by the way, we're not talking about being perfect here, because none of us are. But if you hear these questions or this situation, this scenario, and you think, I don't think people would think that about me, then maybe you may need to recommit yourself to following Jesus more closely and develop some new habits in life. But even as I say that, I want to make something clear. The Christian life is not about just trying harder. It's not just about trying to avoid sin. It's about living in relationship with God. As we do that, as we abide in Christ, he changes us. He changes our hearts. He changes our desires. And he makes us holy. He will help us develop those new habits. So draw near to him. Seek him. Talk to him. Listen to him. Think about him. I know Psalm 1, I wasn't planning to say this, but Psalm 1 says, how blessed is a man who doesn't do these, but he says, and in God's law he meditates day and night. In other words, he's just thinking about God and God's truth. This idea here, think about him. Don't just focus on what needs to change. Focus on him. And follow him. Following him, living for him, will become just normal life. And then, when trouble comes, you're ready. Look at verse 6. Then these high officials and satraps came by agreement to the king and said to him, O King Darius, live forever. All the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors and the governors are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish this injunction and sign the document so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. Therefore, King Darius signed the document and injunction. And so, this group of officials who have schemed together against Daniel go into the king and make a recommendation to him. Now, first, after they greet him, they lie to him. Because they tell him that all of the high officials, along with many other important people in his kingdom, have come up with this idea and think it's a good idea, think it's a good plan. So how do we know that's a lie? Well, because Daniel is one of those high officials, and he wasn't involved in this process. So they're lying to the king. And it's likely that that all the other leaders they mentioned knew nothing about it either. They're just trying to give their idea more credibility. All right, so they suggest that the king make this new law that people are not to make a petition or a request of any god or man other than the king for 30 days. And if they do, they would be put to death by being thrown in with the lions. Now, just reading this sounds like a strange law, and we might wonder why would the king even think that this was a good idea? I mean, so let's talk about this a little bit. First of all, this doesn't mean that no one could ask for anything from anyone at all except the king. So you weren't going to be thrown in the lion's den if you asked your neighbor for a couple eggs. You know, this is referring to a petition or a request like you would make to a god. But the strange thing here is that the Persian kings didn't think of themselves as gods. And so they wouldn't have people pray to them as gods. So this seems strange. This seems to imply that the king would be functioning like a priest, go-between between people and their God. So if they wanted to make a request of God, they had to come and go through the king like a priest. But still, why would the king do this? It sounds like being bothered a lot, right? I mean, why would the king do this? Well, on one hand, this might feed his ego. He is the greatest in the land, the highest in the land, and this would put that on display. Everyone would recognize his greatness because all requests had to go to him or through him. And so this is a great idea if you're proud and you want notoriety. On the other hand, this is a test of loyalty. You see, there very well could be some people in his new kingdom who did not like the king, or did not want him to succeed, or didn't want him ruling over them. And they may even seek to do the king harm. And so these officials play off of this possibility and the insecurities of a new king. You see, if a person refused to keep this law and makes his request or praise to someone else, it shows that the person is not fully devoted to the king. And so it's a test of loyalty. Now, it could be a good thing for the king to know if there's anyone like this, a king who is trying to establish his new rule, rule over the kingdom. And if they did find anyone like this and fed him to the lions, it gets rid of the problem, right? And so this is a loyalty test, and they're playing on the king's insecurity. And so they encourage the king to sign this into law right then. They said, write it down and sign it. And make it official, make it irrevocable. And so they're kind of pushy too. But the king listens to them and he does it. And he doesn't think through it very well, but he does it. But they played on his emotions. They used his pride and his insecurity to convince him that it was a good idea, and they pressed him to do it. By the way, be careful when people come to you with urgent ideas. And when they butter you up, think before you make decisions. Verse 10. When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open towards Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he had done previously. So Daniel had a habit. He prayed 3 times a day. He would go upstairs in his house where he had windows, open towards Jerusalem, and he would pray. Now, you might want to wonder, why pray towards Jerusalem with those windows open towards Jerusalem? It's probably based on Solomon's statement. Solomon, David's son, King Solomon, when he dedicated the temple. And when he dedicated the temple, Solomon asked God to hear the prayers of his people when they prayed towards the temple, towards the house, which was a symbol of God's presence with them. And so it's probably tied in with that. But Daniel did this every day. And this day was no different. It clearly says that Daniel knew about this new law. But he still goes and prays as he always does. He defies the law because he will not neglect his relationship with God, no matter who tells him to do things or not to do these things. He's always done this, and he simply keeps doing what he's always done. What he always does. He doesn't appear to even give it much thought at all, if any. This rule has no impact on him. He simply remains faithful to God. Now, notice that this situation with Daniel, though, is a little different than what happened with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were told to do something that they knew they weren't supposed to. They knew they shouldn't. Daniel is told not to do what he knows he should. But in both cases, they do what is right. But let me point out one other thing. Daniel did right, even when he was told not to. But it wasn't performative, meaning he didn't do this just to be seen. Now, we could think he did. Oh, he went up and opened his windows. No, he always went up and opened his window and just prayed towards Jerusalem. He didn't do this to be seen by them. He did it because it's what he always did. He was already faithfully living in relationship with God and just didn't change to conform to this new rule. So this challenge came to him and he was ready for it. He didn't have to wonder what he would do or if he would do something differently. He didn't have to wonder what was the right thing to do. He just kept doing what he always did. And I think in Daniel we have a great example. We don't do religious things just so people notice. We simply live for God. And if someone tells us not to, we just continue to do what we always have done, living for God. We do what's right in God's eyes, and we keep living for Him. We live to please God rather than people. Well, let's keep reading. Verse 11. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and plea before his God. Then they came near and said before the king concerning the injunction, "O king, Did you not sign an injunction that anyone who makes petition to any god or man within 30 days except to you, O king, shall be cast into the lion's den? The king answered and said, the thing stands fast according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. Then they answered and said before the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunctions you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. Then the king, when he heard these words, was much distressed and set his mind to deliver Daniel. And he labored till the sun went down to rescue him. And so these men, they knew they would catch Daniel. They knew his character and they knew his commitment to God. They knew he wouldn't comply to this law, even if it meant, he wouldn't comply if it meant being unfaithful to God. And so they go and they confirm that he's breaking this law. And they go and tattle to the king, just like the men who tattled on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But when they talk to the king, first they remind the king that he signed this edict and that anyone who broke it would be fed to the lions. But they phrase it as a question because they want to back him into a corner. They want him to realize or to confirm that this was true, that he had signed this law and what the punishment was, and that he can't do anything about it. It's set. He can't save Daniel. But after he agrees that the law is set and it can't be undone, then they tell him that Daniel is guilty of breaking that law. And the way it's stated that he prays 3 times a day, it appears that they watched him for a time. So they didn't see him the first time and then run to the king, but they watched him so they could make their point stronger. They could make it clear that this wasn't a one-time thing. He does this 3 times a day. It wasn't an oversight. Daniel didn't just do it by accident. He's doing it every day and 3 times a day. He's doing it deliberately. But notice how they talk about Daniel too. They call him one of the exiles from Judah. In other words, he's an outsider. He's not one of us. And then they say to the king, he pays no attention to you or the law that you signed. See, they're accusing him of disrespecting the king. That he doesn't care about the king or his authority. They're saying he's rebelling against you, king. It's a personal attack against the king. And then they make it clear that he's doing it a lot. So it's obviously on purpose because he's repeatedly going against the king multiple times a day. And only now does the king realize what's happened, that he's been manipulated. And he knows his back is against the wall. See, by all legal rights, he has to throw Daniel into the lion's den. But he doesn't want to. And so for the rest of the day, he tries to come up with some way to save Daniel. He's looking for a loophole. But he can't find one. Verse 15. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, know, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and Persians that no injunction or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed. Then the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. The king declared to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you. And a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. So at the end of the day, the men come back and they push him to carry out his decree. And they come close to accusing the king of not keeping the law. They're saying, you have to follow through with this. And so he has to condemn Daniel to death. So at this point, he gives in. He gives up, try and find a way out of it, and he gives in. He has Daniel arrested and thrown into the pit with the lions. And the opening is covered with a big rock, and it's sealed with the king's signet, so it can't be opened. And if someone did open it, it would be obvious. So Daniel is stuck there. He's left there in the pit. But as Daniel was being thrown in, the king yells out to Daniel. You see, he wants Daniel to be saved. But this shows that he cares about Daniel. He has friendly feelings towards Daniel, and he respects Daniel. But his words are very significant. First, he knows Daniel's lifestyle and faith. He knows that Daniel continually serves God. May the God who you continually serve. So you're not like sort of devoted to, but the God who you continually serve. Daniel's life is devoted to God, and people know it. It's obvious. His life is a testimony to God. And then secondly, the fact that the king even thinks that it's possible that God would save Daniel or be able to save Daniel shows that Daniel has been talking about God with the king. He's told the king about God. Maybe he heard the story of Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego. The king's heard about these miracles. He's heard about God's power and his greatness. How God has worked through his people. He's heard enough about God that he thinks that the impossible may be possible. So God has worked through Daniel, both through his words and his lifestyle, his habits, his devotion to God, and has revealed himself to this king. What does your life look like? To use a New Testament phrase, do you walk in a manner worthy of the Lord? And do you open your mouth and speak the truth about God? You see, we've got to do both. If we don't live it out, then our words ring empty. And if we don't speak, then our life simply suggests that we're moral people. But when following God is just a normal part of our lives, we can face challenges and trust God because he is in control. Look at verse 18. Then the king went to his place and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled from him. Then at break of day, the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. And as he came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, "O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?" Then Daniel said to the king, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you, O king. I have done no harm." Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him because he had trusted in his God. So this king can't enjoy himself that night. He doesn't want to eat. He doesn't want to be entertained. He can't sleep. He's just too upset. He clearly cares about Daniel. And as soon as morning dawned, he's probably just waiting for light. He can't sleep. He's like, come on, son. But as soon as morning dawned, he runs to the lion's den, and he's calling out to Daniel before he even gets there. He just gets nearby, and he's calling out to Daniel to see if he's still alive. And he asks if God has been able to save him. And again, his words are significant. He again says that Daniel continually serves God, But this time he calls him the living God. So he's clearly heard Daniel talk about God and he expects that that God may have done this. And he has. Daniel answers from the pit that God rescued him by sending his angel to protect him. And he says why he was saved. He says it because he was found blameless before God and he had done no harm to the king. Now this doesn't mean that Daniel was perfect, but he's obedient, he's faithful to God, and he lives for him. He wasn't disloyal to the king. He didn't do anything against the king. In other words, he's not guilty of doing anything wrong here. And so God has protected him, vindicated him, shown that he is not guilty. And so they lift Daniel out of the pit, and he doesn't have a scratch on him. So not only did God shut the mouths of the lions, but God completely protected Daniel from the lions. I mean, they didn't scratch him, nothing. They didn't harm him in any way, and it was obvious to everyone that he was delivered by God because he trusted God. Look at verse 24. And the king commanded that those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions, they, their children, and their wives. And before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. So notice that when the others are thrown into the den, before they even hit the bottom, the lions overpower them and broke all their bones in pieces. Now, this isn't just a gory detail that's given to us here. It's here on purpose. It shows us, it's stated to show us the contrast between what happened to these people and what happened to Daniel. You see, these weren't just laid back, lazy lions. We don't feel like attacking him. It's not that they weren't hungry. They were ready to pounce. They were vicious, and they violently attacked these other people. But they didn't harm Daniel one bit. God performed a miracle and caused the lions to act against their nature while Daniel was in the den with them. It wasn't by chance, it wasn't accident. God is in control. And look at verse 25. Then King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion, people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. So after seeing this miracle firsthand, Darius makes this declaration to all people in his empire. Everyone is to fear and honor and respect Daniel's God. Why? He gives 3 reasons. 1, because he is the living God. This suggests that he's more than just a metal or stone or wooden idol, but he is alive. It directly states that he is alive. He's the living God. And the living God is able to give life. He was able to save Daniel. But not only is he alive, he will live forever. And his kingdom and his rule will last forever. And he's powerful. He does miracles. including saving Daniel from the lions. God is in control. And he works in this world and makes himself known to people. He worked through Daniel, and Daniel faithfully served him and lived in obedience to him. And today he will use us too, when we trust him and when we faithfully seek him. As his people, we have the privilege of being part of his work here on this earth, in this world. And if we experience hard times, which we all do at times, but if we experience hard times, or if we are attacked like Daniel was, we can trust God and keep living for him. I just want to read a couple of verses for you. James says in James chapter 1, verse 2 to 4, he says, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." And then in James 1:12, he continues and says, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him." He said, when we live in faith and we face trials, God uses those hardships, uses those trials to grow us, to make us more holy, to make us more godly, to make us more Christ-like. We will learn to trust him even more when we go through those trials. And as we look to him, we become more and more mature, more and more Christ-like. And not only that, but we know that we will be rewarded in eternity. We know that we live in a world, in a culture that is not godly. In fact, it is often opposed to godliness and opposed to living in God's ways. And they may even come against us at times for living in God's ways, come against us as we live in relationship with God. But when we live in relationship with God, when we live seeking him first, when we live trusting him, when we live with our focus on him, and this is just normal life for us, then we know God is in control, and we can face whatever comes our way and honor him. May our lives be filled with habits that honor and glorify our God.